Hi everybody, welcome to the Agosia Art Studio. I am getting ready to start a whole new bunch of figures, and that means diving into my stash of felted wool sweaters. And here is just one of many bins that I have. And I realized that this is quite the treasure trove because it is getting harder and harder to find wool and natural fibers of any kind. It doesn't matter if you're going to thrift stores or if people are donating items to you. It's just really tough, and wool especially is disappearing. So I know that I really advocate using wool. It's what I use to make all of the heads, and I think it is just a fantastic fiber. It's easier to sew, it's easier to work with. But what do you do if you can't find wool anymore? And I get a lot of questions about this. What kind of sweaters can you use? So what I did is I went to the local Goodwill and I bought a couple things, and I'm going to show you some ways that you can test your sweaters to see if it's going to work for the layering techniques that I use in my dolls. I went to the local Goodwill and looked for some sweaters, and I got a selection here so that I could show you some things that are good and some things that are bad. And I think none of these are 100% wool. And like I said before, wool is getting harder and harder to find. So depending on where you are and your sources for sweater material, you may just not be able to find wool. Well, the next best thing is a high content wool blend. This is a men's sweater, and it is 80% lamb's wool, 20% nylon. And I suspect that it was taken to Goodwill because it is already a little bit felted. You can just barely see the knit stitches here. It's not as stretchy as it used to be, and there's a thickness and a density to it that means for a lot of people that the sweater has been ruined. But for my purposes, this is actually perfect. So I bought this, and I will actually wash it as I do all my wool garments in hot, hot water, and then a hot dryer, and I will see if it will felt and condense even more. So what makes wool so great for the kind of sculpting that I do is this fine, smooth surface, because I can add layers and layers and layers, and it builds up. So there is some thickness here. I don't know if you can, I guess I should cut into this, but there's thickness, but it will blend in with the layers below, and at the same time, the quality of the wool fibers means that even though you have a thick stack of wool, and it may be, 3 or 4 inches thick, you can get a needle through that really easily. Let me reach across over here and get a doll needle. So this is a doll needle, and this is a super long one, but something like this is what I use to put in the eyes and to put in the head joint. So you do use a needle, and it is a very thick needle. It's about the thickness of a tapestry needle. So if we get a whole bunch of layers of this and make like a big old wad here, and we put the needle in, it just goes in like a hot knife through butter. So when you're actually doing any sewing, the needle goes in very easily, it sinks in, and it's easy to work, and it's just easier on your hands. The other great thing about felted wool is that if you cut a hole in this, it's not going to fall apart and start unraveling. It's going to stay together, and you will have a little divot. And that's important because that's how I make the eyes. Okay, so this is one sweater. This is lamb's wool. This is a men's sweater and nylon. I found this one, and I gotta say, it is getting harder and harder to find wool sweaters. This is Uniglow, which actually kind of surprised me, and I think the label is inside here. And this is pure wool. And again, I think that to the person who donated this, it may be ruined, so to speak, because it is already lightly felted. People just don't know how to wash wool garments, wool sweaters, to keep them stretchy and knit. And this one is still pretty stretchy, but since this is 100% wool, if I put this in the washing machine, it's probably going to shrink down to about half the size that it is now. So you can find wool garments in a variety of different thicknesses, and what I prefer for my sculpting methodologies are wools like this. It's just what they call stockinette stitch, so it's a smooth surface that you can add layers and layers and layers. Sometimes all you can find is cables and stuff like that, and I really don't advise using that because those bumps will show. I'm going to move this aside, but what if you can't find wool? What are you going to do? Okay, so what you want to avoid is anything with texture. Even with wool, I don't like doing this. This is, you know, good old-fashioned 100% acrylic sweater. And this is a cute little sweater, actually. It's a kid's sweater. And all of these bumps, they're just, you know, if you wad them up, you layer them together, those bumps are always going to be there. So this heavy yarn, the problem with synthetics is that the yarns aren't as compressible as wool is. That's one of the wonderful things about wool. So you have these bumps and you can't felt it, so you can't smooth it out at all, and these bumps never go away. So with my methods, what happens is, you know, you build up the layers and the layers and the layers to make the head, and then you cover it with fabric. And I had a piece of fabric here, and of course now I cannot find it. And what happens is, if all you have is like thin, and this is an extreme, this is a pretty sheer muslin, if you're covering the surface, you can see all of those little bumps there. There, if I hold it just so, you can see the bumps from the knitting underneath, and you don't want that. The other thing is that even though this is a pretty open knit, well, this one, okay, this one is easy to get the needle through, but sometimes they're not. One of the weird things about acrylic yarns, especially older sweaters, is that the yarn, it has a hardness to it. So it's difficult to needle, and if it's difficult to get that needle in, you can hurt yourself while you're stitching or trying to do your joints. So this would be a no-go because of the cables and also because of the size of the yarn. Okay, so not great. Cute sweater for a kid. I'll probably return this one. Let's see, I've got another one here. This is a little cotton sweater. And again, another nice one. The knitting is a little bit finer. You can see that it's a little bit tighter, so maybe it would work. You know, it's, you always kind of want to test. If you have a doll needle, the thing to do if you're shopping for sweaters to use for my kind of sculpture is to take your needle with you and make wads of fabric at Goodwill and see how easy it is to get that needle through. And this is very, very hard to get that needle through. So I wouldn't choose this for that reason, and it's also very heavy. It has a weird kind of density. Wool takes up a lot of space, but it's still very soft. So if we do this test to see the texture, you can see that it's not as bad. There's some smooth, it's a smoother surface than the previous sweater. So this one would be okay in terms of layering, but not so great in terms of needling. So this was a cotton sweater, and, you know, I guess a relatively fine yarn. Let's see. So then we have, oh, I don't even know what this is. I guess most sweaters these days are acrylic. What is this? Sometimes you can't even see the tags, or they've been ripped out. No, I don't even know. So I would guess that maybe this is acrylic, and it has a rib. So this one is pretty soft. It's really elastic, as you can see. And there are pros and cons to that. It's going to make it difficult to do layers and layers because each one gets thinner and thinner and thinner, and so you have to do so many. This one is okay to get the needle through. It's not too bad, but I mean, you can see all that texture. So when we do this test, yeah, I mean, you can see that ribbing. So, you know, this would not be the greatest. If this is all you had, then what you would have to do is use maybe multiple layers of your covering fabric if you're using a cotton. Okay, and this, I would say, and you can't really tell maybe on the camera, but this is like really cheapo acrylic sweater kind of thing. It has that weird kind of sparkliness. I don't know. It's kind of a weird. This is the kind of sweater that you get and you're hot in it because it has zero breathability. Okay, so here's another one. This is, let's see, I think this is like an acrylic mohair, and you see that a lot. You know, by themselves, acrylics aren't necessarily bad. I think I prefer nylon, but with mohair, you almost always, okay, so this is 100% acrylic. And, you know, they're getting better in terms of making something feel like a natural fiber to, how it feels to your hand, but how it actually behaves while you're wearing it is a totally different thing. And a lot of these sweaters tend to be very hot. So this one is actually pretty nice. I kind of like the way it feels. It has a little bit of sponginess. It has a little bit of stretch, but not too much. The yarn is very, very fine. So the problem that you're going to have with something like this is building up layers. You're going to have to use a lot of layers. But it is very easy to get the needle through. So that's a good thing. And then, well, you can still see a little bit of those knit stitches. So, it's a tough thing. If all you can find are acrylic sweaters where you are, just take some thin muslin or white cloth, because you're going to see any weirdness most easily with this. And take either a doll needle or a nice thick tapestry needle, something like this, and wad it up and start sticking the needle in and see how it is to work with it. If you really hate it, and you might, one of the things about wool is when you cut into it, it's just really nice and tidy. But these acrylics, they leave little bits of fuzz all over the place. They're very, very messy to work with. They fray. So with a felted wool, you're going to cut it and it's going to be the size and shape that you want it to be. But with these knits, it may not do that. You may have little bits of yarn all over the place and little bits of fuzz. So just be aware of that. So, look for wool if you can. I know it's getting harder and harder to find. Ask your older relatives. A lot of them have wool that they're hanging on to. And for doll making, you can use things that are moth-eaten, that are stained, that are felted and out of shape, and you'll give it a new life and it will be great. But if you can't find it, well, you got to test all those sweaters and see how they are to work in your hand.